Good evening and welcome to the British School and to the fifth lecture in the series accompanying our annual master's course in the archaeology and topography of the city of Rome. Tonight it's a great pleasure to welcome one of our BSR Rome Award holders, Alessandra Tafaro. Alessandra is currently postdoctoral researcher at the University of Macerata. She took her degree and master's at Rome's La Sapienza in classics and philology and was awarded her PhD at Warwick University last September for a thesis entitled Inscribing Flavian Rome on epigraphic strategies in Martial's epigrams. Her work sets out to reevaluate our understanding of literary and sub-literary cultures in the Roman world. She's published already on the interface between Martial and epigraphy and has just brought out a new article on Martial and the Carmina Latina Epigraphica in the volume Dynamic Epigraphy, New Approaches to Inscriptions, edited this year by Ellery Cousins for Oxbow. Tonight, we're lucky to be hearing a preview of the new project she's carrying out here at the BSR in a lecture we're recording and with which our online viewers can engage by sending in questions using the Q&A panel on the screen. So would you now please welcome Alessandra Tafaro and the Gladiatorial Graffiti of the Roman Amphitheatre, long-lived memorials of imperial munera. Alessandra.
So good evening, everyone. I'm extremely honored today to present my research for the City of Rome lecture series, and I would like to really thank Robert for his extremely kind invitation and the British School at Rome, in which is offering me the unique opportunity to pursue my research on gladiatorial graffiti. So today it will be an occasion for me, an opportunity to explore with you the preliminary outcomes of a new project on the graffiti preserved for us in the amphitheater, and to challenge notions of instability and impermanence that are traditionally associated with graffiti writing and epigrammatic poetry. So as scholars have argued, Rome was always a theatrical or even amphitheatrical culture in which performance, roleplay, display, and viewing were constitutive features. With the accession of the Flavians, a new claim was made for the primary role of spectacles in the workings of political power. In particular, the Roman amphitheater was a key site for the exhibition of Caesar's rulership and authority. Spectacles, which permeated every aspect of Roman public life, are commemorated across different media in the ancient world, including monuments, inscriptions, literary texts, and art objects. Gladiatorial shows, alongside ludi scenici, ludi circenses, mimes, and pantomimes, represented one of the most appreciated forms of entertainment in the ancient world. So from stucco reliefs to paintings, oil lamps to graffiti, statuettes to gems and glasses, material culture testifies the popularity that the games had achieved in the ancient world. In this context, a close comparative analysis of literary text and epigraphic evidence proves crucial to understand the mechanisms of the Flavian culture of display. Martial's Liber Spectacularum, which was possibly composed in the year 80 AD in occasion of the inauguration of the amphitheater, plays its own distinctive role in the creation of the Flavian discourse of spectacle. As scholars have emphasized, the epigram, which is witty and pointed, represents an ideal literary form to extol the thaumastic and paradoxical aspects of the spectacles, whose allegorical significance Martial interprets in order to create the Flavian political ideology. By expanding and shrinking, multiplying and halving perspectives, Martial creates visual snapshots of the arena games, putting on display the sense of impermanence within the amphitheater, which is a monumental meeting place between the dying and the living. Simultaneously, exceptional examples of gladiatorial graffiti have been found scratched on the seating orders, stairs, and Marburgs Labs of the Flavian Amphitheater. Spurred by the arena shows, spectators represented in the here and now the highlights of gladiatorial spectacles, either as endorsements of their favorites or as impromptu memorials. By capturing the transient nature of imperial games, the graffiti disseminated across the Roman amphitheater raised crucial yet unanswered questions about the culture of graffiti writing, urging us to investigate the extent to which the monumental context of the amphitheater in which gladiatorial drawings are preserved challenge scholarly perceptions of graffiti as ephemeral, informal, and unsophisticated. Despite the scholarly renewed focus on gladiatorial graffiti, the wider significance and contextual interpretation of this epigraphic category still seek critical reappraisal. So in this lecture today, it is my intention to pursue a close comparative reading of epigrams from Marshall's Liber Spectacularum, the official inscriptions from the amphitheater, and gladiatorial graffiti, shedding, hopefully, new important light on strategies of memorialization of the arena games. I shall explore in particular how epigrams and gladiatorial graffiti, interspersed with visual and material symbols from the amphitheatrical world, function as expansive narrative media through which contemporary readers and viewers gain a new and distinctive experience of the spectacles. Although epigrams and graffiti were perceived as being similar in their content, extemporary nature, and tone, I shall argue that these two forms of writing embed a paradoxical idea of monumentality and enact comparable commemorative functions. While epigrams and graffiti are hastily composed as ephemeral divertissements, they both eternally memorialize the arena shows. And like graffiti, which exists as text as much as material objects, and which are scribbled in the hic et nunc, epigrams are simultaneously embedded and transcendence, occasional yet enduring poems with which to hail the new Flavian dynasty and remember the political meaning of the games. These performative contradictions, as I will suggest, between transience and transcendence, ephemerality and inscriptional durability, play with and are framed by the amphitheatrical coexistence of two epigraphic voices, that of the official inscriptions, which responds to political and ideological needs, and that of graffiti, which survive as memories of the imperial games. So the talk will be divided into three sections. Section 1 will analyze the official inscription and Flavian political propaganda lurking behind the Roman amphitheater in relation to the opening sequence of Marshall's Spectaculis 1-3. And after a discussion of the loca inscriptions in the cavea, section 2 will explore Pompeian graffiti and the relationship between gladiatorial munera and funerary processions, investigating techniques of temporality in graffiti and epigrams, which similarly master time. They both capture the ephemeral spectacles in extemporary forms of writing and media. However, their monumental context makes the arena games live on across the centuries. And in section 2.3, I will read gladiatorial graffiti found in the Roman amphitheater and Spectaculis 30-31 in juxtaposition. So upon his return from the campaign in Judea in 71, Vespasian greeted Rome largely ravaged by the Great Fire of AD 64, the civil conflicts of the year 68-69, and deeply marked by Nero's architectural exaggerations. Vespasian's interventions in the city, which sought connections with the Julio-Claudian dynasty, emphasized the restoration of the imperial machine to its fullest abilities. Rome's new monuments, which acted as visual reminders of the Flavian recovery of the empire from its momentary collapse, were imbued with a spirit of renewal. The amphitheater, which was itself a fulfillment of an Augustan project, was the ideological symbol of the start of a new grandiose era, an opus publicum in opposition to Nero's privatization of large public areas, also the official propaganda runs. It stood at the heart of Rome as a message of imperial ergetism and was carefully presented as the material calm of the Flavian victory in Judea. The sack of Jerusalem in AD 70 offered Vespasian a ready-made opportunity to conceal the memory of the recent turmoils of the year 68-69 and to celebrate his successful suppression of the provincial revolt. Such a propagandistic maneuver is mirrored by the original dedicatory inscription of the Flavian Amphitheatre, which Gedal Foley has brilliantly restored. So the epigraphic text, which we have on the right, identifies the spoils of the Judean war brought to Rome in a triumphal procession in AD 71 as the financial resource for the building. The expression ex manubis, which occurs again in the dedication of Trajan's Forum, evokes the Republican and Augustan custom of exploiting war incomes for public buildings, while highlighting Vespasian's propagandistic aims. The original dedication of the monument in bronze letters has been reconstructed from the peg holes still visible on the surface of a 5th century inscription engraved on a marble block which commemorates the restoration of the amphitheatre by the urban prefect Rufius Cecina Felix Lampadius during the reign of Theodosius II and Valentinian III. So on the left, you can see these peg holes, and Gazalfodi was able to reconstruct the bronze letters, the position of the bronze letters. So as scholars have argued, the inscription constitutes a double palimpsest. The dedication of the monument, previously ascribed to Vespasian, was later credited to Titus through the insertion of the praenomen Titus between Vespasian's official titles, Imperator and Caesar. Contemporary literary sources echo the Flavian propaganda by presenting the amphitheatre as a munus, namely a gift to the people of Rome. Within the Liber Spectaculorum, written in AD 80 to celebrate the inauguration of the amphitheatre, Martial's presentation of the building as a generous benefaction to the people of Rome, Deliciae Populi, quae fuerant Domini, and as a gift of the emperor, Caesario Amphitheatro, responds to and resonates with imperial propaganda, which sought not only to present the civil strife of the year 68-69 as a bellum Neronis, but also to enhance the public memory of the success over Judea. So with these premises in mind, I will turn now to the prefatory epigrams of the Liber Spectaculorum, which offers a key political and ideological reading of the Flavian Amphitheatre and introduce themes which are central to illuminate the relationship between monument and its official inscriptions on the one hand, and epigram and the graffiti on the other. So the opening sequence of the book, Spectaculis 1-3, represents a coherent introduction to the collection. Spectaculis 1 envisages the amphitheatre as surpassing all the world's wonders. Spectaculis 2 locates the monuments both physically and ideologically within the urban fabric of Rome, contextualizing the political superimposition of the Flavians on Nero's Golden House and fostering the desired connections with the Julio-Claudian dynasty. And Spectaculis 3 brings the reader into the cosmogonic vision of the arena, where the world is miniaturized and captured within Titus' new architectural feat. So in this epigram, Martial claims the superiority of the amphitheatre to the most popular monuments. In a characteristic preamble, the pyramids, Babylon, the Temple of Trivia, the Tomb of Mausolus, all the world's marvels are exhorted in a prophetic gesture to fall silent in order to let deity fame speak of one work only, namely the wondrous opus of the amphitheatre, as we can see in the last line, unum procunctis fama loquetur opus. The concluding verb of utterance, loquetur, underscores the silence to which the glorification of other monuments are relegated. The topos of present outdoing past recurs in the book as a leitmotif, capturing the tension between singing and falling silent. Throughout, present amphitheatrical realities put to silence ancient myths, prisca fides taceat. Similarly, at the very end of the collection, Caesar's naumachia in the stagnum of Augustus eclipses the spectacles of his predecessors. The personified Fucine Lake and Trojan and Nero's pools are injuncted to be silent, for after Titus' aquatic marvels in Augustus' stagnum, they have nothing to be boastful about. So the concluding line of Spectaculis 1, Fitzgerald argues, encapsulates a double pun. Martial exploits the ambiguity concealed in the preposition pro, which simultaneously summons the meaning of one instead of all others and one on behalf of all others. Therefore, the new Flavian building will not merely reprise, but also represent all the other wonders on the lips of posterity. But a further double meaning is condensed in the final word opus, which summons up both the meaning of architectural and literary work. Martial's hailing of the Flavian achievement is wittingly intertwined with the elusive celebration of his own poetry, a literary masterpiece with which he not only celebrates the dawn of a new dynasty and its monumental achievements, but also offers the image of himself as the ideologist of the regime. The architectural metaphor, alongside the reminiscence of Horace's Ode 330, encapsulated in line 1, evokes the trope of poem as monument and the related sense of instability which permeates the Augustan literary imagination. Marshall acknowledges that the epigram is both transient and transcendent. It can give voice to the official epigraphic propaganda by presenting the Flavian buildings, including the baths of Titus, as imperial gifts, munera, in response to the original dedication of the monument as a manual benefaction. Yet, by speaking as a member of the audience, Marshall creates epigrams dashed off in the here and now as an immediate response to the games, eliciting the private voice and impromptu nature which is typical of graffiti culture. As Milner notes, unlike state records of decrees or dedications, both funeral inscriptions and wall writings employ a distinctly private authorial persona, that is, both claim the attention of the reader not on the strength of public authority, but on behalf of an individual and subjective voice. The particular nature of graffiti, which preserved the original context of production, invites us to read these texts as physical remains of the act of inscribing them. A Virgilian intertext complicates further the interpretation of the last line in Spectaculis 1. This unum procunctis fama loquetur opus evokes the episode of Palinurus' death at the end of Aeneid 5, where Palinurus' life is sacrificed to Neptune as a condition for the safe journey of the Trojans to Italy. Unum promultis dabitur caput. Marshall, therefore, transposes the memory of Palinurus from an unknown land, ignota arena, to the illustrious amphitheatrical arena, which disposes of the ephemeral lives of gladiators and venatores for mass consumption and exchanges old myths for new thaumastic events. In Spectaculis 1, Marshall's substitution of caput with opus invokes a disquieting image that reworks and reconverts the Virgilian passage. While the life of one man only was lost to save the lives of many, the praises of the world's wonders will yield to the celebration of the amphitheater. But more to the point, Marshall's evocation of Virgil unum procunctis introduces an irrational idea of sacrifice, which invites us to wonder whether this is not a way for the poet to prefigure the execution of prisoners in the role of mythical and literary heroes. In addition, Marshall's allusion to substitution and sacrifice at the end of Spectaculis 1 elicited the memory of Nero as a scapegoat for the Flavian propaganda, which intentionally sacrificed the image of the last of the Julio-Claudians to blur the events of the civil war. By reversing the oblivion brought by Somnum and Lete to Palinurus, Marshall paradoxically suggests that there can be no forgetting without remembering, and that the Flavian amphitheater could not exist without differently recalling the Neronian past. So in a provocative response to Flavian political aims, Marshall plays his own distinctive role in presenting the amphitheater as an anti-Neronian symbol in the city. From the international visual of the amphitheater in Spectaculis 1, the epigrammatic focus shifts to its physical and ideological setting in Rome. Raising on the lake of Nero's Domus Aurea, Stagna Neronis, as we can see on line 6, the amphitheater establishes a sharp contrast between Neronian and Flavian times, in which the palace of Nero was turned into a spectacular public venue. The antithetic pairs of now and then underscores how the unum opus of the amphitheater now substitutes the unaque domus, Nero's golden house. The pun which Marshall develops on Nero's una domus suggests that the poet had intentionally reworked key themes of imperial ideology. A few anonymous verses are known to have been circulated under Nero's reign, which were openly satirizing the excessiveness of his Domus Aurea. The anonymous couplet, preserved by Suetonius, runs, "Rome will become a single house, moved to obey citizens if that house doesn't occupy they too." This anonymous poetic text represents a witty invective directed against Nero's lavish Domus Aurea, whose construction had not only morphed Rome into a single private house, but also potentially threatened to conquer Veii. By alluding to the sack of Rome by the Gauls and the episode of Camillus resisting to move to Veii, this pasquinade represents Rome as a ravaged capital, dominated by one house only. Nameless defamatory verses reveal interconnected responses to imperial censorship. Political graffiti and anti-Caesarian lampoons populated the urban environment in either written or oral forms and stimulated active responses from the readers' viewers. It is therefore not hard to imagine how such pointed verses could be welcomed by the Flavian regime. Martial, who perhaps alludes to this pasquinade in Spectaculis II, plays farther on the unum procunctis of Spectaculis I. While fame will speak of the amphitheater as usurping and encompassing all the world's marvels, the verse unaque iam tota stabat in urbe domus in Spectaculis 2.4 exemplifies the shift from Nero's private occupation of public space for his own personal pleasures, domini, to the complex of the amphitheater, erected for the entertainment of many. As scholars have noted, Martial fosters the image of Nero as the tyrannical usurper, while exalting the democratic move of the Flavians. To conclude, in Spectaculis III moves from the physical setting of the amphitheater within the city to the spectacle of a cosmopolitan audience. This epigram illuminates further the ways in which Martial interacts with the official inscriptions in the cavea of the Flavian Amphitheatre and with poetic passages, promoting simultaneously the international fame of the Flavians and of his own opus. Martial shows the reader the international audience of the amphitheatre. What people is so far removed and so barbarous that there is no spectator from it in your city? The open rhetorical question, directly addressed to Caesar as a compliment, enhances the exotic character of the amphitheater, which was compared to the pyramids of the Barbara Memphis in Spectaculis I. There is not such a remote people in the world, and implicitly less civilized, who is not acquainted with the new myths of the amphitheater and Caesar's wonders. The multitudes of Sarmatians, Arabs, Sadei, Cilicians, Sugambri, and Ethiopians hasten, festinavit, festinaveret, line 7, towards Rome to unanimously lair the emperor as pater patriae. So the miscellaneous and heterogeneous voice of the empire, vox diversa, will be here reduced to one unified vox, tum tamen una est, under the emperor's rulership. The experience of the spectacle, therefore, creates a cohesion which such a gathering of foreigners would not experience otherwise. Despite the rhetorical exaggeration which permeates the present epigram and its international audience, epigraphic evidence within the amphitheater, across the provinces and in Italy, mainly from Pompeii, demonstrate that spectators were expected to travel significant distances to watch the games. A set of inscriptions from the marble raisers of the sitting orders in the amphitheater, which have been mostly dated to between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD, when the monument was restored after the Great Fire of AD 217, allot sitting spaces to various social groups according to the Lex Iulia Theatralis and the Lex Roscia Theatralis revived under Domitian, including delegations from outside Rome. That hierarchical and social divisions were enforced in the amphitheater finds its testimony in various inscriptions engraved on the marble raisers of the cavea seats, part of which is still visible in the reconstructed sector of the cavea. So this picture is taken from within the amphitheater. While the Meneanum Primum, closer to the arena, hosted the knights, the two sectors of the Meanianum Secundum hosted progressively lower social strata, and the Meanianum Summum were reserved to the plebs. CIL 632/98, so here, B, reads Equitibus Romanis, proving that the Lex Roscia Theatralis, according to which the first 14 rows were assigned to the equites, the knights, was observed as early as the inauguration of the amphitheater. Collective names in the dative and more rarely in genitive or nominative case, followed by the measurement in feet and submultiples of a foot, so semis and unce, of the width of allotted sectors, were engraved on the marble raisers of the steps in various sitting orders. The inscription CIL 632/098E, found in the sitting number 5 of the amphitheater, reads Hospitibus Publicis and confirms that such sitting blocks were reserved to delegates who had a privileged relationship with Rome, Hospitium Publicum. Similarly, clientes coming from colonies and municipia under the jurisdiction of Rome and the Gaditani who had their own official representatives in Rome, were entitled to occupy a specific sector of the cavea, as far as their local inscription demonstrates. While the local express the authoritative voice of official inscriptions engraved on the marble surfaces of the amphitheatre, the seating orders of the cavea, as we can see from this reconstruction, offer a ready-made writing environment which was exploited by spectators to draw gladiatorial graffiti. So as we can see, two spectators here are represented in the act of drawing graffiti on marble steps. Whereas, and also in the other marble derisers, you can see that there are some drawings. So this is a reconstruction, but it's probably quite accurate. So as Orlandi shows in her landmark work on epigraphic evidence from the amphitheatre, the building proliferates with inscriptions. Alongside the official epigraphic records of the various building phases of the amphitheatre and inscriptions on the riser of the steps related to the loca, gladiatorial graffiti have been found scratched onto the seating orders, the stairs, the marble slabs, and statue bases of the amphitheatre. As the inscriptions engraved on the marble risers of the steps in the cavea reveal, spectators used to entertain themselves with board games in intervals between the shows. Tabula illusoria, checkboards, and board games of various kinds, which are still visible on the marble slabs of the steps, provide evidence for the ways in which the audience experienced the arena games. By capturing the transient nature of imperial games, the graffiti disseminated across the Roman amphitheatre offer modern viewers a mediated experience of the shows. Unlike official forms of writing, graffiti embed private and intimate perception and gain meaning from the physical context in which they are inscribed. Although they perform a different kind of authority, their embeddedness in the monumental space of the amphitheatre makes them, to an extent, no less monumental than official inscriptions. As in many amphitheatres in Italy and the provinces, spurred by the arena shows and within the intervals between the different games, spectators decided to represent in the here and now the highlights of gladiatorial munera, either as endorsements of their favorites or as impromptu memento of the combat. Both in Rome and Pompeii, gladiatorial graffiti are disseminated across various areas of the towns. In Rome, beside the Flavian Amphitheatre, the Basilica Argentaria, the Pedagogium, the Domus Tiberiana, and the Ludus Magnus offer evidence for many gladiatorial drawings. All these graffiti, however, have been dating to between the 2nd and the 3rd century AD. Despite the late dating, it is very likely that the culture of graffiti writing was already spread in Rome well before the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. As Barbara Kellum argues, and as evidence from Pompeii demonstrates, the gladiatorial combats in the amphitheatre, the circus games, the theatrical performances were not spectacles that existed apart from and in opposition to the quotidian words of streets, but rather ritualized extensions of a spectacular culture that pervaded all aspects of Roman urban life. So in the nearby Pompeii, destroyed in AD 79 by the eruption of Vesuvius, the popularity of gladiatorial shows is well attested. The amphitheatre, the peristyle of the House of Gladiators, where graffiti have been attributed to gladiators themselves, the surfaces of many tombstones outside the Nucerian and Herculaneum gates provide us with crucial evidence for the production and dissemination of these texts. Many of the surfaces of the tombs host the edicta munerum, namely notices for the games of the towns in the Campanian region. Nola, Nuceria, Puteoli, Herculaneum, and Cumae advertised their own forthcoming spectacles in the necropolis just outside Pompeii, so that the announcement could be visible to passers-by as much as to Pompeian inhabitants. Beside the advertisement strategies, the spatial environment in which graffiti and game notices intermingle evokes the original function of Republican spectacles, which were offered as munera to the deceased in the context of funerary processions. Epigraphic evidence confirms that the religious significance of gladiatorial games. Scenes of gladiatorial combats, chariot races, and boxing matches have been found depicted on the tombs of Paestum as early as the 1st century BC, while 1st and 2nd century AD inscriptions from Sinuessa testify for the organization of gladiatorial spectacles to commemorate the deaths of private citizens. Gladiatorial games were therefore in origin funerary games. From the late Republic, gladiatorial shows were referred to as munera gladiatoria, namely as gifts or homage to the deceased during funerary procession for local aristocrats. This seemingly finds corroboration in the tombstone of Umbricius Scaurus in Pompeii, outside the Herculaneum Gate. Although current scholarly debate prevents us from advancing a secure hypothesis on its identification, the stucco relief on the tomb arguably commemorates scenes of gladiatorial combats and hunting, each labeled with inscriptions which were perhaps held on the occasion of Scaurus' munus funebre. As we can read this is the Edictum Muneris, and it reads, for the spectacles of Numerius Festus Ampliatus on the last day fought, although the summo is quite controversial. So the funerary context for the representation of such gladiatorial shows encapsulate an uncomfortable association between spectacles and death, ephemeral arena shows, and marble memorials. Sabatini Tumolesi interprets the expression die summo as equivalent to supremo die vitae, namely the last day of life, rather than the last day of a longer munus, protracted across various days, suggesting that the munus was commissioned to Numerius Festus Ampliatus by Umbricius' father to commemorate his son's death in occasion of his funerary procession. Various interpretations have been offered on the reason why Umbricius decided to commemorate Festus Ampliatus Munus. It has been suggested that Umbricius was an editor of the games, or that he wished to commemorate one of his favorite shows, which he attended during his lifetime. However, it seems probable that Umbricius Scaurus' father decided to pay homage to this son death by making the famous lanista Festus Ampliatus organize the munus, which is commemorating upon his tomb, demonstrated that even in imperial times, the association between gladiatorial munera and funerary procession was still strong. So Pompeii constitutes a fitting comparandum for the graffiti preserved in the Flavian Amphitheatre. The amphitheatre, the corridors of the theatre, private houses, public shops testify for the wide excitement engendered by gladiatorial shows. The house of the Cryptoc Porticus in Pompeii offers a wealthy evidence of graffiti representing scenes of venationes. Similarly, a graffito scratched in the lower register of a fresco upon the doorstep of a shop in Pompeii in Regio 7 represents two gladiators engaging in a fight, although, yeah, this is the first gladiator, and here we can see the legs of the other gladiator, and probably they are labeled by their own names. The graffito, which either advertises a forthcoming gladiatorial combat or commemorates a past show, clearly evokes the enthusiastic engagement of fan spectators with the games. Remarkably, a gladiatorial graffito scratched on the theatre's corridor constitutes a close precedence for, so here you see the two gladiators and the other gladiator, for the gladiatorial graffiti that we find in the cave of the Flavian Amphitheatre. These graffitos suggest that in context of amphitheatrical performances, spectators represented in the here and now records of their favorite shows, offering a long-lasting memorialization of the games that has unexpectedly and paradoxically survived across the centuries. Implicitly, the Flavian Amphitheatre, which preserves the memory of gladiatorial fights to pictorial and verbal graffiti, becomes itself a gigantic metaphorical tombstone, a memorial for the lives of the gladiators and venatores. A good variety of gladiatorial graffiti, mostly dated to the 3rd and 5th century AD for the style of the representation and paleographical aspects, have been rediscovered in the amphitheatre. The Great Fire of AD 217 and many rebuilding phases of the monument may account for the late dating of this text preserved in the sitting orders. As the aforementioned evidence from Pompeii suggests, however, and along with the inscriptions of Bloca dating to the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, graffiti were already part of the theatrical writing environment as early as the opening of the amphitheatre. Depictions of gladiators are normally accompanied by very synthetical forms of writing. The names of the combatants, the number of victories and fights, whether they won, were reprieved, or died, are usually combined with visual symbols representing acclamations for the gladiators. It is not surprising that the boundaries between iconographic and verbal messages collapse, with letters transforming into pictorial elements and vice versa. There are, however, circumstances in which no text labels the drawings of gladiators. So part of this epigraphic evidence is currently on display in the exhibition of the Colosseum, revealing the widths and types of graffiti that spectators engrave with a sharp object on the surfaces of the amphitheater as extemporary yet long-lived memento of the games. The short time span of a gladiatorial combat is not only captured in the temporal fixity of the gladiatorial drawing, but the graffiti itself embodies a powerful narrative medium that functions as a proxy for memory and stimulates modern viewers to live anew the ephemeral spectacles. While spectators scratch graffiti on the marble risers of the amphitheater's cavea during the intervals between the spectacles, Marshall captures the arena shows in epigrammatic snapshots. Yet, occasional epigrams and impromptu graffiti have eternally preserved the amphitheatrical games for us. So here we are looking at epigraphic evidence from within the amphitheater. So fans could represent in the here and now their favorite gladiators and capture the particularity of a moment. Such is the case of a Retiarius, a lightly armed gladiator standing with his trident and a high knee greaves, whose figure was scratched on a Marburgs Lab on the seating order of the cavea. Similarly, fan spectators depicted 2 consecutive scenes on the marble raisers of a seat. While the upper register of the slab represents a Retiarius fighting against a secutor, one we recognize from the rectangular shield and the helmet, the lower register depicts a hunting scene. A dog chases a gazelle and a bull. Here we have a bull, the dog, and the gazelle. Often single depicted gladiators are accompanied by short inscriptions indicating the name, the number of victories, or the outcome of the combat. The fragment belonging to a marble slab of the amphitheater sitting order records the cognomen delicatus, scratched above the head of a figure without helmet, one critics have identified with a Retiarius or Bestiarius. So the head is here, and here we have delicatus. Currently on exhibit in the second order of the amphitheater, the Marburgs Lab CIL 63260 depicts 2 gladiators. The inscription Quintus Iocus, although here we see just the left part of the stone, the inscription Quintus Iocus labels the male figure on the left, which is not unfortunately in the picture, while the name Vindicomus and a theta nigrum, which indicates the deaths of the gladiator, identifies the Retiarius. While the Latin word iocus might be interpreted as an invective against Quintus, namely object of bluff, Vindicomus is the gladiator's nomen artis, a compound of vindex and comes, namely avenging comrade. Both texts are scribbled in the hic nunc by spectators who wish to fixate the particularity of a moment and the outcome of a show into written record. Despite its extemporary nature, the graffiti nonetheless provides contemporary viewers with a indeed is at the same time compressed and crowd's acclamation for their favorites finds numerous expression in extant graffiti. Crowns, palms, laurels, exclamations such as feliciter or augural monographs often accompany representation of gladiators. A victorious standing Retiarius wearing a turquoise and holding a palm leaf is depicted on a slab of Cipollino marble. On the upper section, the letters TER here are still visible, suggesting that the integration with the enthusiastic acclamation feliciter for the combat's successful outcome. Similarly, 2 laurel crowns and palm leaves and the augural monogram PEL decorate another fragmentary slab found in the amphitheater. So these are the 2 crowns. We find honorus inscribed within, and here we have the augural monogram PE, which all conflates basically. The name of Honorus, which as Orlandi suggests can be read as in the incorrect form of the well-attested cognomen Honorius, is inscribed within the upper crown. Both the augural monogram and the crown suggest that fan spectators would record their victories of gladiators or wished a successful outcome for the gladiatorial engagement. This specimen well exemplifies a collapse between iconographic and textual elements that is typical of graffiti, where the visual and the verbal could be turned into one another before the very viewer's eye. A further graffiti, which is very important for my argument today, scratched onto the arena seats and currently on display in the Colosseum, dating to the 4th and 5th century AD, is particularly interesting for its visual symmetries and the interplay between iconographic and textual elements. The graffiti constitutes a key parallel for Marshall's Liber Spectaculorum, the Epigram Spectaculis 31, which stages a gladiatorial combat between the gladiators Priscus and Verus. Two standing gladiators, both awarded with the rudis, are surrounded by symbols of acclamation and victory, crowns, palms, and laurels, and accompanied by 3 inscriptions. The fragmentary status of the stone does not allow the reconstruction of inscription A, which should label the figure on the left. What seems readable is the letter IUTOR. Based on a comparison with graffiti from Pompeii, however, such as CIL 4, 5279 and 5282, which read tu mortus est, tu nuga est, Orlandi interprets inscription A as an invective against the adversary. According to Orlandi, the proposed restoration li mortus would find corroboration in further examples of wishes for defeat found within the amphitheater, in which the adjectives such as nuga and iocus are interpreted as offenses directed against rival gladiators. Inscription B offered the example of exhortation for the victory of Limenius, whose name is combined with the Latin transliteration of the Greek verb nika and by the monogram PE, which reads either as palma et laurus or palma et feliciter. This monogram, labeled by Orlandi as an ideogramma con valore di amuleto, which results from the combination of the letters P, E, or F and L, is well attested in late antique iconography of gladiators as a formulaic acclamation. The material objects of gladiatorial rewards, such as palms and laurels, visually conflate in a highly symbolic letter, while each gladiator is accompanied by a convex object adorned with small circlets that can be identified with a crown and a rudis. Just to clarify, so these are the objects which I'm referring to, which are still slightly visible in the picture. Inscription C has been interpreted as the addition of a different hand and has been read as quintus vicit. Autoptic study of the stone and close analysis of Langner's picture of the graffito, however, suggest instead the reading quintus fecit, which could be interpreted as the graffiti's signature. Arguably, this hypothesis is corroborated by 2 additional examples from the amphitheater. Lupercus fecit and the cognomen Quintus scratched upon a tabula lusoria demonstrated graffiti authors were inclined to claim the authorship over their drawings. I will now turn to the juxtaposed reading of gladiatorial graffiti and epigrams in the Liber Spectaculorum, which performs a paradoxical memorialization of gladiatorial fights. Marshall's exploration of the monumental and material qualities of the epigrammatic medium in comparison with other visual media is problematized in one of the concluding epigrams of the collection, which highlights how the epigram expresses the more subjective and less authoritative epigraphic voice of the amphitheater, that of gladiatorial graffiti. The paradox of graffiti as less durable in medium and message and yet gaining monumental meaning from its physical embeddedness in the amphitheater allows Marshall to explore further the contradiction at the heart of the Flavian monument and of the epigrammatic medium. So towards the end of the collection, the reader finds a section dedicated to the aquatic games, which includes a naval engagement, Leander swims, and the aquatic display of the Nereids, who decorate the waters with various formations. Their dance creates recognizable forms of oars, ships, stars, and broad sails, such as to deceive the spectator's view. And here important is the credidimus remus, credidimusque ratem. So we believed in the whore and we believed in the ship. The final line implies that the narrates learned these performances not from Thetis, but from a more powerful divinity, namely the emperor. With this epigram, which exalts both the narrate's ability to produce visual images in the water and, by extension, the epigrammatic visual renderings of such exploits, Marshall is laying a foundation for Spectaculis 31, which draws upon material symbols of the gladiatorial world. Furthermore, the use of the verb pingere arguably anticipates the comparison between Marshall's gladiatorial epigram and the gladiatorial graffiti preserved in the amphitheatre, which disclose the subjective feelings of spectators. The verb deployed to refer to narrate's act of depicting the waters with images, pinxit, vividly evokes the ways in which graffiti authors proclaim their own authorship. A clear example is provided by a gladiatorial graffito scratched in room 8 of the Pedagogium on the Palatine Hill. The graffito represents a gladiatorial fight between the Retiarius Antigonus and the Contra Retiarius Superbus. The arbiter Casontius, holding a wooden rudis and a trident, urges both gladiators to fight, accede. Sodzon, although we don't have the name here depicted, is the picture who proclaimed his authorship over the graffito. The verb pingere primarily refers to a depicted representation or to the act of decorating and painting. Nonetheless, graffiti writers often use pingit or pinxit along with scripsit and fecit to labor their verbal and visual creation with their own signatures. While pingere is well attested in graffiti, verbs such as facere and scribere are commonly deployed by graffiti artists. Therefore, when Marshall stages the epigrammatic metamorphosis of the narrates into different formations, he implicitly suggests that the water becomes a canvas or wall which offers no obstacle to their describing patterns, and metaphorically to his own verses. It is tempting to interpret the verb pingere at line 2 of Spectaculis 30 as providing a thematic and formal link to the juxtaposed Spectaculis 31, where Marshall plays more explicitly with the constitutive elements of graffiti culture. Marshall's narrates, therefore, are metaphorically appending their own signature to the decoration that they will form in the amphitheatre's water canvas, while paving the way for the parallel with graffiti that is made explicit in Spectaculis 31. Marshall's epigram is imbued with visual formation, verbal and sound symmetry, which make the reader appreciative not only of the literary quality of the text, but also of its visual dimensions. Visual symbols and paratextual elements played indeed a crucial role in the comprehension of epigraphic texts. The layout of inscriptions was integral to their communicative effectiveness, for readers were first called to view and thereafter read the text. By creating visual symmetries and patterns that anticipate the combat's outcome between Priscus and Verus, Marshall aligns his text to gladiatorial graffiti. By evoking graffiti and exploiting the verbal and visual language of such spontaneous forms of writing, Marshall explores the nature of his poems as simultaneously text and objects. By reproducing the material and visual aspect which are constitutive of gladiatorial graffiti, Marshall puts into play the relationship between word and image that is inherent to graffiti and stresses the tension between authoritative and public writing versus private and subjective graffiti that construct the amphitheatrical epigraphic record. So Spectaculis 31 stages a metaliterary combat between two gladiators, namely Priscus and Verus. Marshall's playfulness with material objects from the gladiatorial world and the distinctive conflation of words and images in this epigram have generally gone unremarked. However, the epigram's symmetries and evocation of gladiatorial symbols corroborate the analogies between epigram and graffito. Although gladiatorial munera were supposed to continue until one of the contestants raised his finger to acknowledge his defeat, or until the editor of the games was convinced to spare the spectator's favorite, the combat between Priscus and Verus extended itself for a long time without a clear winner. Marshall stresses the memorable quality of this context, implicitly celebrating the even-handedness of the emperor, who decided to reward both gladiators with rudis and palmas, symbols both of reprieve and the gladiatorial victory. The apostrophe to Caesar at line 11 focuses the reader's attention on the supernatural presence of the emperor, who has produced such an unexpected outcome. Marshall's game on symmetries and asymmetries occurs again in Spectaculis 23. The emperor, moved by the spectators' plea, gives proof of magnanimity by allowing both the gladiators Mirenus and Triumphus to appear on stage and engage in a combat. The symmetrical division of the spectators calling from Mirenus and Triumphus, emphasized by the parallel cola in line 1, pars ec, pars illa, finds its solution in the gladiatorial fight allowed by Caesar Dulce Ingenium. Similarly, the equal engagement between Priscus and Verus is visually recreated by the symmetrical disposition of the words within Spectaculis 31, the anaphoric imperfect subjunctive triaret of verse 1, which temporally emphasizes the continuity in time of the encounter and its conclusive outcome, the reiteration of pares at line 8 and the anaphora utrique at line 1, visually reproduce the gladiators' comparable capacities in the match and anticipate the combat's outcome. The epigram's position in the collection and the speaking name of Priscus and Verus encourage, I argue, a metaliterary reading of the text. Within the book, the so-called fatal charades play a dominant role. Heroes from the mythical past are executed and the refrain quid fama canit prestat arena tibit witly frames many poems throughout this in a formulaic manner. In this epigram, Priscus allusively refers to the fabula prisca, the old fabled myth, while Verus implicitly alludes to the amphitheatrical veritas, that by reifying, staging, and making it visible as outdone myth. Caesar's influence has ingeniously reconciled both the mythical past and the wondrous realities of the amphitheater. The opposition between old poetic and mythical stories and the present spectacles find its only apparent resolution and reconciliation at the end of this epigrammatic gladiatorial combat. The ephemeral and disposable lives of both these metaliterary gladiators are immortalized not only in the elegiac couplets, the metrical form of epitaphic commemoration par excellence, but are also preserved in comparable ways in gladiatorial graffiti, as we have appreciated, which have been found within the Flavian Amphitheatre. The visuality of this epigram and the gladiatorial symbols with which Marshall consciously intersperses his epigram, such as rudis, palma, and lances, alongside reference to the narrates depicting various formations in the water, invite comparison with gladiatorial graffiti scratched onto the seating orders in the cavea of the Flavian Amphitheatre. These artifacts, which are traditionally represented as ephemeral in medium and message, and as more impermanent than monumental inscriptions, have offered a long-lasting memorialization of the short lives of gladiators within a monumental environment. So to conclude, by reading this epigram in combination with Limenius' graffito, parallel strategies of memorialization of the arena games emerge. Marshall's epigrams not only recreates visual symmetries, but also morphs objects which are normally represented as pictorial elements in gladiatorial graffiti into words. Marshall's palmas and rudis translate into words the monogram PE and the wooden's word, while the victory verbally represents the lower breadth. By stimulating visual responses in the reader-viewer through visual symmetries and by acting as a reminder of the gladiatorial engagement, the epigram appropriates the playfulness with iconographical elements, converting into verbal elements, which is typical of graffiti. So graffiti responses to the spectacles highlight the spontaneous and immediate nature of such forms of writing, which differ from the extant forms of public and authoritative written documents with which the amphitheater is populated, and are an expression of a subjective rather than collective voice. Similarly, Marshall represents himself as a member of the crowd, dashing off epigrams in the here and now to please the emperor, addressing the protagonist of the games and the emperor from one of the sitting rows of the amphitheater. As the graffiti authors were responding to the visual environment surrounding them, so Marshall was interacting with and responding to the thrilling atmosphere of the arena. In the context of the amphitheater, epigrams and graffiti are embedded in the spectacular space of the amphitheater, becoming an equally paradoxically long-lived memorial of the fleeting pleasures of the arena. Marshall indeed was intentionally aligning his experience in the amphitheater to that of graffiti writers in order to suggest that his epigram could be virtually scratched onto the walls of the city of the amphitheater like graffiti. So as we have discussed, the amphitheater appears as a writing environment in which spontaneous and ephemeral wall writings have become integral to its monumental architecture. Within the monument, the authority of official inscriptions recorded the building phases of the architecture, the monument and extemporary graffiti all share the same representational space, a venue that already reinforced social hierarchies and put on display power relations amongst Romans and foreigners, Romans and emperor. By association with their material context, extemporary graffiti, whose physical embeddedness in space and material context is integral to their interpretation, have become monumental, endowed with a memorializing function which can be compared to that of epigrams. The disposable lives of the epigrammatic Priscus and Verus, Triumphus and Mirinus, and the graffitis Quintus and Limenius, encapsulated in the monumental environment of the amphitheater, embedded in its marble sitting orders, have lived on across the centuries. Although the extant graffiti evidence within the amphitheater is scarce and mostly dated to the 5th century AD, it is not hard to imagine how the games would have stimulated similar responses in previous centuries, and to picture both epigrams and graffiti as an immediate product of the wondrous realities of the arena. To an extent, Marshall's epigrams and graffiti share a paradoxical conceptualization of monumentality. If they are both occasional, ephemeral in nature, they gain monumentality by association with their context, integral to the monumental fit of the amphitheater. Graffiti and epigrams are simultaneously densely material and yet sculpted as they are out of marble, are endowed with a longer lasting legacy. As Barbara Kellum demonstrates, gladiators were cultural heroes of everyday life in Pompeii. In the Liber Spectacularum, Marshall celebrates these new heroes who outdo the myths of old ones. Marshall and graffiti writers alike offer a wicked twist to poetic monumentality, preserving the fleeting spectacles in a medium which is by nature occasional and impermanent, yet memorial and monumental. Epigrams and graffiti, which show a flexible relation between the visual and the verbal, act as proxies for memory. And by recalling the particularities of a moment and stimulating the readers' and viewers' evocation and participation in absentia in the arena marvels, they both simultaneously act as textual and material objects capable of rescuing the otherwise forgettable protagonist of the arena from oblivion. At the same time, imperial munera, which are permanently recorded and monumentalized in the graffiti scribbled in the marble environment of the amphitheater, are embedded into all forms of everyday minutiae. To an extent, the gladiatorial graffiti function not only as an eternal memento of the games, but when morphed into three-dimensional exchangeable gifts, munus, they become a cheapened and miniaturized version of imperial munera. Ties for famous gladiators, gladiatorial statuettes offered as gift in the context of the Saturnalia, statuettes of gladiators with priapos and apotropaic tintinnabula, testifying not only for the fascination exerted by gladiatorial games, which permeated every aspect of ancient life and nurtured the imagination, sexual imagery, and religious beliefs, but also suggest a paradoxical reification and materialization of the arena games into cheap gifts. Gladiatorial ephemeral lives are permanently captured in the gladiatorial graffiti, monuments carved out of marble. On the other hand, they continue existing in all forms of material objects, gift for exchange, reified version of imperial munera, which have endured the history of time. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Alessandra. You've given us a wonderfully rich and beautifully illustrated account of non-elite spectacle and non-elite spectators, although obviously non-elite doesn't mean lacking in quality, because some of the drawings you showed us from the marble monuments were, at least to my eye, of extremely high quality, as were some of the comments from the graffiti writers as well. And also for those of us on the course, you've provided an excellent literary and sub-literary commentary on all the monuments we've been looking at this week in the Colosseum Valley. So an absolutely splendid lecture. We've got time for some questions. We've even got some coming in already online. Perhaps I could start with a comment which involves your interest in Marshall as well, who I suppose certainly cannot be considered a non-elite artist. It was absolutely fascinating, your hypothesis that he may even have been influenced by graffiti artists. And it certainly seemed, there was certainly some really strong parallels you made. I just wondered, partly thinking of your other work on Marshall, is there any evidence of Marshall himself in exchange influencing not necessarily graffiti writers, but do we see Marshall being quoted or cited in frescoes or
absolutely,
you know, in inverted commas, non-elite art?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the main research trajectories in the relationship between epigraphy and literature is to try to look into clausulae or literary syntagms, which are quoted by epigraphic poetry. For example, I'm thinking about this, or in graffiti. So for example, Pompeii is very famous for the arma virumque tag. But absolutely, so my idea was to do the reverse journey and try to see how epigraphic writing and literary writing are more in an intertextual dialogue and not necessarily as two separate and distinct phenomena. So there is evidence for Marshall being quoted in graffiti, and there is currently a good friend and a scholar of graffiti who is studying the relationship between Marshall's obscene epigrams and Pompeian graffiti and insults in graffiti. We have evidence, of course, if I'm thinking about the indices of the Carmina Latina Epigraphica, of some of Marshall's syntagms being quoted in, most of all, in epitaphs. And there is some evidence, I think, one of the epigrams in book 140, I think, because it's seemingly a proverbial expression. I think it's quoted in one of Pompeian graffiti. But yeah, in this way, I wanted to show that there is a protean, let's say, relationship between epigraphy and literature, and by making Marshall seemingly look at graffiti, I think that this relation, this mutual dialogue can emerge more. Yeah,
it's really interesting, this interrelationship. We have some questions starting over here.
Thank you. That was absolutely wonderful. A true Veni Vidi Vici moment, as far as I'm concerned. A true triumph. I was wondering, coming at this, of course, not as an ancient historian, but as someone working from another period. When I thought before meeting you of graffiti in Rome, I have to think of the Villa Farnese, which was like where they still have graffiti of German soldiers who sacked Rome in the early 16th century, and that it's very much the graffiti there, in my view at least, is very much just, I'm here, That's the reason why, people, still carve graffiti today. And I'm just sort of wondering how representative is the graffiti that you've been looking at inside the amphitheater, inside the Colosseum, and inside these spaces? How representative is this type of very artistic graffiti of all graffiti that's there? Have you been looking at a subsection, or is this really just, this is, is there no graffiti of the sort of more basic kind of later periods, or is it really just literally the type that you've been looking at?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. So of course, the evidence I've been looking at mainly is mainly focused on the gladiatorial graffiti, but there are some modern and contemporary graffiti actually scribbled on the monument, which is not necessarily, maybe in 2000 years we'll be studying that and say this is a form of authoritative representation. But yeah, apart from the gladiatorial graffiti, there is evidence for tabulae illusoriae, which are checkboards basically. So the spectators used to entertain themselves by scribbling these tabulae illusoriae or writing their own name, for example. So there is in the catalog, which I was using on the inscriptions of the amphitheater. We have some other kinds of graffiti, like simple names, for example, or as I was showing earlier, the Lupercus Fecit, for example. So we have some sort of drawings which is not necessarily recognizable at the moment, so it's difficult to decipher what's in there. But there is this idea of self-representation and the will to self-affirm the person. I have not met any kind of quotation, literary quotation in the amphitheater actually, so it's more related to the amphitheatrical word, but definitely we have some sort of sense that other forms of graffiti could have existed. And of course Pompeii is our research for the graffiti, which gives us more insights into the variety of graffiti that we can find.
Dustin?
Thank you very much, Alessandra. And just kind of building on the previous question and thinking about the kinds of people, the groups of people that the amphitheaters are bringing together. Are all the seating arrangements officially written in, or are there groups of people kind of carving their group's name in, and they're like, oh, we always sit in the north corner, so we're going to carve our name here and this will be our spot?
So as far as I am aware, so the local inscriptions are the ones which I was interpreting as the official inscriptions, so the official and authoritative voice of the Colosseum. So I wouldn't be able to give you a straightforward answer in this moment, but I would be inclined to think that normally the loca are official inscriptions which were officially carved actually. And in Pompeii, looking at the amphitheater, I didn't see any kind of suggestions for, like giving us an idea that people could carve their own name and say, this is my space here. So it was more unofficial, especially because it was regulated by the various leges, so the lex Roscia Theatralis and the lex Iulia Theatralis. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
My question is slightly relevant to this. I was interested not to the visibility, but to the lack of visibility of the graffiti and the connection with your idea of monumentality that you brought at the end of your presentation, namely, if there is evidence, let's say, from a graffito that was not easily seen, that a person, as it were, became part of the monumental building by inscribing something that was just for himself or for herself, as opposed to being visible by the others who seen it, and then left satisfied that he too or she too was immortalized. Is this something too far-fetched as an idea, too crazy?
No, absolutely. Thank you so much, Kostas. This is a very fascinating question. I have not thought about any earlier, but it seems absolutely fascinating. And as I was really focusing on the visibility and the visual symmetries and this idea of wanting to be part of the monumental, let's say, by being visible and becoming integral. But as you say, this hidden, let's say, interpretation and trying to be immortalized without other people realizing is even more intriguing, and definitely like a further path to explore, because effectively as we were seeing from the reconstruction, I don't think that the graffiti were extremely visible as soon as you entered, of course. And having been in Pompeii and having looked at the graffiti, sometimes it's difficult to spot them. So even this idea of intimacy, let's say, and this idea of being immortalized but know it for yourself and not being exposed and on complete exhibit in front of the other spectators would be absolutely a fascinating idea. Thank you so much, Costas.
Thank you.
There's an interesting question from one of our online viewers, Tracy Raviotti, who asks, how were the graffiti made? And were they planned in advance to some degree, as implements to make the inscriptions would have needed to be taken to the amphitheatre by the spectators? Thinking about the metal detectors we have to go through.
Oh, okay. So, as looking at the graffiti, of course, I've seen them just once, the visu. So, looking at those which are on exhibit, you can see the difference in how they are inscribed. So, some of them have a more marked sign in the stone, and they were like incised, carved with a sharp object. And some others are more like the Limenius graffito, for example, are more subtle in their way in which they're scribbled, basically. So yes, they were made. They were carved into the stone with a sharp object, as far as we can see. Were they planned in advance? So the idea of graffiti is always an idea of being impromptu and being really done in the Ikatunung, on the spot. And even looking at graffiti, the suggestion is that the spectators were really drawing the gladiators on the spot. And for the latest question, I have not. Okay, would that need to be taken? No. Okay, so yeah, I wouldn't know. I think like they brought it from home, probably. But yeah.
Yeah, obviously some were more assured than others. You said a lot about the spectators and the dialogue with the spectacle. Do we have much evidence for the voices of the participants? So I was thinking of some of the gladiators' epitaphs.
Okay.
Certainly,
yeah.
I'm not imagining that we have any evidence of gladiatorial graffiti in the Ludus or something.
Well, yeah, we have some. Actually, there are some graffiti which have been written by gladiators, probably, and they are in the barracks of gladiators in Pompeii, and these are. Let's say, proclaiming their sexual prowess. And so we have the gladiator being the lover of girls, or like they present themselves as Latin lovers. So we have some of the voice of the gladiators really spoken in Pompeii, although it is difficult to really see where these graffiti currently are, but they've been published, so they are in the CAL for sure. And of course there are epitaphs, and especially I think most of the epitaphs have been set up by the woman who spent the life with the gladiators. But generally I would tend to say, but now I can't remember all the clay by heart, that they are more like prose inscriptions with the mention of the age in which they died, and so on.
I remember one, I think it's cited in Mary Beard's book, where he says that although he had the sun in his eyes, he slaughtered his opponent like he was a donkey, which is quite a brutal example. Sally.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. It was really interesting. I just wanted to pick your brain a little bit about whether you had any thoughts on depictions of violence in graffiti and its role in allowing for spectators and their processing of violence.
Like more a cathartic value of the graffiti. So from the graffiti we have seen, there is not really like a representation of such a form of violence. It seems that these graffiti are more proclaiming the favorite spectacles, or they are wishing well to the favorite gladiator, for example. But absolutely, I think part of the function of the graffiti could also be, there could potentially be some catharsis. Although if I'm thinking about the graffiti represented in Pompeii, the one which we saw under the fresco on the taberna in Regio 7, it seems that graffiti responds more to a strategy of memorialization or to strategies of advertisement. So that graffiti the interpretation of that graffiti is a bit ambiguous because we don't know whether that combat gladiatorial engagement has already happened or whether it is an advertisement for a future show. But definitely it is something to explore. The problem with the graffiti, which are still on site in the Colosseum, for example, that the evidence is a bit scanty. And in Pompeii, within the amphitheater, we have very few. I think there are just 2 gladiatorial graffiti, and they are mostly very highly symbolic, so not really a representation. Also because I think it would be difficult to really depict also in a more specific way than violence.
Lucas.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for this amazing talk. I just thought about what Sally said, and I had a book in my hand today, Manuel Flecker, Roman gladiatorial reliefs, which mostly come from funerary monuments of the magistrates that gave those munera. And those often depict very gruesome scenes. So you have gladiators kneeling down, the sword being pushed through their backs. They're quite harrowing, and I wondered how this compares to the graffiti. So do you think the graffiti spectators mostly memorialize their favorite gladiator, whereas the magistrates that commission those reliefs more sort of try to put on display that they spend a lot of money on the gladiators and they hence died?
Absolutely, thank you so much, Lucas. Yeah, there's absolutely a difference, especially in the gladiatorial reliefs that we find in the tombstones, because of course there is a political edge, let's say, in the organization of gladiatorial munera, and so the people who were in charge of organizing the munera really wanted it to be remembered, and they wanted to be thanked and remembered for this and commemorated for this. That's why we find very frequently these gladiatorial reliefs on the tombs. And the idea of munus, which is like a munus, so a gift that you pay to the deceased, and a munus as a spectacle. There is this game, this double-edged game going on the term munus, which starts as a funerary munus and then becomes a spectacles, and then it makes all the way back to become like immortalized in a funerary monument. So definitely there is a difference there in the intentionality, if you want to say that, in the authorial intentionality and in the or aims and purposes of the 2 depictions, of course. So yeah, I hope that answered partly your question.
Okay, well, I think we should give Alessandra a well-earned rest now, especially after raising so many fascinating questions about this somewhat depressing attitude, especially your comment at the beginning about a place where the living and the dying come together. I think we're all in need of a drink after that. So thank you very much, Alessandra. Thank you to our audience for the questions, and we welcome you up for a drink after the spectacle. Thank you.